All right, so today we're doing something a little bit different. We're not just going to tell you a story. Nope, we're going to take a story apart, piece by piece, to see how a legend is actually built. We're going to look at the dramatic opening of a tale about one of the world's most talked about families and use it to understand the architecture of myth-making itself. Okay, let's get into it. So it starts right here. The first image you get is one of confinement, of being boxed in. And see, the walls are closing in even more. You can almost feel that sense of being trapped, can't you? And now, it's not just physical walls. The oppression is systemic. It's official. The story makes it crystal clear. This is a place of absolute powerlessness. And then, bam, the pivot. A total 180 in just a few words. From the absolute bottom, something huge, something immense is born. Pretty powerful stuff, right? I mean, that introduction is designed to hook you, and it does a great job. But how? How does it get that effect? Well, that's what this explainer is all about. We're going to break down the architecture of this legend, using the very words you just heard as our blueprint.
So let's start with part 1, the stage of the myth. Because in any great story, where you begin is every bit as important as where you end up.
So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, why start here? A story about a family that would supposedly finance nations, and it doesn't begin in a palace or a bank? It begins in a ghetto? Why do that?
And this is where it gets really interesting. This is the engine of the whole narrative. On one side, you've got the premise, the ghetto, the locked gates, total powerlessness. And on the other side, the unbelievable outcome, a dynasty, global wealth, control of empires. That massive gap between the start and the finish, that's the fuel for the legend. It creates instant drama and makes their rise to power seem almost supernatural.
Okay, so that contrast sets the stage perfectly. Now let's move on to our second point, the vocabulary of power. Because it's not just what the story says, it's the specific emotionally loaded words it uses to tell it.
I mean, just look at these words: wealth, secrecy, power, fear, nations, empires, shadows. These aren't neutral everyday words, are they? No way. Each one is packed with a sense of incredible scale, of mystery, and yeah, even a little bit of danger. They're chosen for a reason, to lift the story from a simple family history into something epic.
And this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The text could have just said family, but it didn't. It chose dynasty. Think about that for a second. A family has cousins and uncles. A dynasty has rulers, a line of succession. It implies this long-lasting, almost royal power. It's just one word, but it completely changes the frame of the story.
Now here is an incredibly clever narrative trick. By using phrases like some say, others say, or many believe, the story can introduce these massive, unproven claims, controlling empires, ruling from the shadows, without ever saying they're facts. It's basically outsourcing the big claims to rumor, which funnily enough makes the myth feel even bigger and more widespread. So we have a dramatic setting and a powerful vocabulary that's all built on rumor. But what's the glue that holds it all together? Well, all of this leads us to our final section, the unanswered question. This is the real engine of the mystery and the source of its lasting power. Let's look at this one more time. But where does the truth end and where does the myth begin? This question, right here. This is the whole point of the introduction. It's not just a clever sign-off, it's the main event. You see, the power of this legend comes from the fact that it doesn't give you a clear answer. That fuzziness, that ambiguity, that's not a flaw in the story, it's the most important feature. It intentionally blurs the line, and that creates a space where all the speculation and mystery can just grow and grow. It invites you, the audience, to wonder, which is way more powerful than just being told a bunch of facts. So if we were going to write a recipe for creating a legend like this, here it is. Step 1. You have to establish a super dramatic origin, that ultimate from rags to riches story. Step 2. You use a very carefully chosen vocabulary, words of immense power and mystery. And step 3, the real masterstroke, you frame the whole thing with a big, central, unanswerable question that just fuels our fascination forever.
And that kind of leaves us with this one last thing to think about. When a story is built this well, when it becomes this powerful in our culture.
Okay, so we're diving into a story that, honestly, it feels like it's straight out of a thriller. It's about a man who started with, well, less than nothing, and built an empire. But not with armies or land. He built it on a single, powerful idea. An idea that would totally reshape how power works. Let's get into it. Our story starts right in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. But we're not in some grand palace or towering fortress. No, we begin in a cramped, walled-off street, a place literally designed to keep a certain group of people in and to keep them down. And that boy is Mayer Amschel Rothschild. Now, back in 18th century Europe, these three things, titles, land, protection, they weren't just nice-to-haves. They were everything. Without a title, you were a nobody. Without land, you had no wealth, no real future. And without protection, well, you were just completely at the mercy of anyone more powerful than you. So his starting point, it wasn't just zero, it was deep in the negative. To really get who this man was, you have to understand the cage he was born into, the Frankfurt Judengasse, which translates to Jew's Alley. It wasn't just a neighborhood. You got to picture it as both a physical and a legal prison. And the rules of this prison, they dictated every aspect of his life. And these restrictions were absolute. Think about it. Cannot own land means you can never build lasting generational wealth the way the aristocracy did. Cannot join guilds means you're locked out of almost every respectable profession. And cannot hold office? That means you have zero political power, no voice at all. The whole system was built to make sure that people like Mayer Amschel stayed exactly where they were, powerless. But here's the thing. When every single conventional door to power is slammed shut in your face, you've really only got two choices, right? You either give up, or you find a brand new door. Mayer Amschel found a new door. And it all started with one revolutionary idea. You see, while all the nobles and the kings were busy counting their acres of land and polishing their family armor, Mayer was looking at the system itself. He wasn't just playing the game, he was analyzing the game board. And he spotted a crack, a kind of hidden dimension that pretty much everyone else was completely ignoring. And this was it. This was the light bulb moment. It's so simple, but it's absolutely profound. Land is stuck in one place, right? Titles and nobility, they're only recognized in one kingdom. But money is different. Money can flow under walls, it can zip across borders, it can move silently through the middle of a war zone. It was a type of power the old world just couldn't fully grasp, let alone control. So he was essentially rewriting the entire rulebook for how you get power. The old way relied on stuff you could see, armies, castles, borders on a map. The new power he was building was invisible. Instead of armies, he used information. Instead of land, he used trust. Instead of titles, he built networks. And this is the key. Instead of worrying about borders, he turned silence into a weapon. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a clever business plan. This was a kind of economic insurgency. It was a rebellion against a system specifically designed to lock him out. So let's break down these new weapons he chose. His first weapon was information. Just imagine for a second, what if you knew a government was about to need a massive loan, or that a war was about to end, hours, maybe even days, before anyone else, before the markets could react? That knowledge isn't just power, it's a gold mine. He built this incredible network of agents and couriers that was often faster and more reliable than any government's. His second weapon was trust. Now, in an age before international banking laws and regulations, a person's word, their reputation, was everything. Mayer Amschel built a reputation that was so rock-solid, so ironclad, that princes and powerful merchants would give him their fortunes to manage based on nothing more than a handshake. His name itself became a kind of currency, and frankly, it was more stable than the currencies of many kingdoms. And his final and maybe his most powerful weapon was silence. The aristocracy, they were loud. They loved their parades, their giant palaces, their fancy portraits. Mayer Amschel understood that real power doesn't need to shout. By operating quietly, in the shadows, he avoided jealousy, he avoided scrutiny, and he avoided attracting the attention of powerful rulers who would have absolutely crushed a more obvious competitor. So with these three weapons, information, trust, and silence, he built something the world had never really seen before. It wasn't an empire of land you could see on a map. It was an empire of influence. A vast web of financial connections that stretched all across Europe, totally invisible to the naked eye, but felt in every single hall of power. And this, right here, is the masterstroke. By the time the kings and emperors of Europe finally woke up and realized that this one man from a ghetto in Frankfurt had made himself essential to their own finances, funding their armies, managing their wealth, the system was already built. The network was too deep, it was too wide, and it was too important to just get rid of. The man who was once locked out of the system had become the system. You know, the story isn't just about a guy from the 18th century. It's really about the nature of influence itself. And it makes you ask a pretty big question. In our own world, a world of digital information and global networks, what kinds of invisible empires are being built right now, in silence? What forces are shaping our world that we can't even see?
When you think of an empire, you probably picture armies, flags, and vast territories, right? But what if an empire could be built without firing a single shot? It all boils down to this. You know, history is packed with these big, loud turning points. But this one was quiet. It was deliberate. It was a single, strategic choice made by one man, Meyer Rothschild, that would unleash a whole new kind of power on the world.
So what was this huge, history-changing decision? Well, it wasn't some declaration of war or a new law passed by a king. Nope. It was a business plan. But a business plan with the kind of ambition you'd expect from a global dynasty. So let's get into it.
And this is a huge shift in how you think about power. The plan was to send his 5 sons out across Europe, but their goal wasn't military conquest. They weren't there to overthrow governments or seize thrones. They were there to fund them. Their power was going to come from finance.
Okay, so you have this brilliant strategy, but how do you actually pull it off? Well, this is where the map of Europe basically becomes a chessboard for the Rothschild family. It was all about 5 sons in 5 key cities. This is how the network got built.
Yeah, this number, 5. It's not just a number, it was literally the cornerstone of this whole enterprise. 5 sons placed in 5 incredibly strategic locations, and each one became like a critical artery pumping money and information through the heart of the continent. And these were the hubs. I mean, look at this list. London, the absolute center of global trade. Paris, a cultural and political behemoth. Vienna, the capital of the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire. Naples, a vital port. And Frankfurt, of course, their home base. By putting a son in each city, they created this cross-continental financial institution that was bound together entirely by family loyalty.
So the sons are in place. But what made this so different, so revolutionary? It wasn't just having people in different cities. Lots of people had that. It was how they were connected. They built something totally new, an invisible network. You can almost think of it as a 19th century version of the internet.
This was their secret weapon, a private, closed-loop network just for money and information. It was exclusive, it was secure, and here's the most important part. It was just faster. Way, way faster than anything the established powers of the day could even dream of.
And that speed gave them an unbelievable advantage. So just picture this. A king is waiting weeks, maybe, for a courier on horseback to deliver his orders. At the same time, the Rothschilds are using private agents and carrier pigeons to send messages that arrive in a fraction of the time. While governments were slowly shipping wagons of gold guarded by soldiers, the family could settle a massive debt between London and Vienna with just the stroke of a pen.
And that's the whole point right there. Their power wasn't just about having money. It was about the speed at which they could move that money and the information that went with it. In finance, just like in war, speed is everything. And they were operating on a completely different timeline from the rest of the world.
Now, when you're this efficient, this fast, it has consequences. And in this case, those consequences were huge and, frankly, a little scary for the old guard. See, governments started to notice this network, and they began to use it. And that one decision led to this irreversible shift in the balance of power. It created a whole new dynamic: dependence and fear.
The path to power was actually pretty simple when you break it down. First, you offer a service nobody else can, like funding a war or stabilizing an entire economy. Then governments get so used to that service, they become totally reliant on it. They literally can't function without you. And once you're indispensable, well, you're not just a service provider anymore. You have real influence. This is the key word right here: dependence. We're talking about the most powerful states on Earth realizing they needed this private family network to pay for their armies, to get crucial intelligence, and to keep their economies from collapsing. They became clients. And that's the climax of this whole story. Because dependence, it creates fear. But this wasn't the old fear of an invading army. No, this was a modern fear. It was the fear of being cut off from the system. The fear that a private family, with its own agenda, knew more about your own kingdom than you did, and could move financial mountains before you even knew there was a problem.
Which really leaves us with a question that's just as relevant today as it was 200 years ago. True power isn't always the stuff you can see. It's not always the armies and the palaces. So often, it's the invisible networks that control how information and money move around the world.
You have to picture the early 1800s. Europe is literally on fire. The Napoleonic Wars are raging, and this is conflict on a scale nobody had ever seen. It's just tearing the continent apart, redrawing the map of the world with every single battle. And the stakes? They couldn't be any higher. This was a time of complete chaos. Monarchies that had been around for 1,000 years could just vanish overnight. It was an era of unbelievable risk, but for a certain few, it was also an era of incredible opportunity. You know, wars aren't just fought with soldiers and cannons. They are fueled by money. And out of all this chaos, a new kind of power was rising. Not on the battlefield, but in the banks and counting houses of Europe's greatest financiers. And this is where the Rothschild family built their immense power. They had this incredible network, right, with sons placed in all of Europe's major financial hubs. This setup let them move gold across warring borders, funding armies like the Duke of Wellington's. They were, in effect, financing both the survival and the collapse of nations. And it all comes to a head in 1815, at one single pivotal moment, the Battle of Waterloo. This is it, Napoleon's last stand. The fate of Europe is hanging in the balance, and a legend is about to be born, not with swords and muskets, but on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. And here it is. This is the absolute heart of the myth. The story goes that Nathan Rothschild, who ran the London branch of the family, used his private network of couriers to get the news of Napoleon's defeat a whole day before the British government itself knew. And in the world of finance, that little head start, well, it wasn't just valuable, it was everything. So what does the legend say Nathan did with this incredible secret? He walks onto the London Stock Exchange, says nothing, and just starts selling his British government bonds. And of course, everyone else sees the great Rothschild selling, and they assume the worst. Wellington must have lost the battle. Panic selling just erupts. The whole market goes into an absolute freefall. And you can imagine the effect. In that chaos, the value of government bonds, we're talking the bedrock of the entire British economy, they plummeted to basically nothing. People's life savings were just wiped out in a matter of hours, all because of a false assumption triggered by one man's supposed actions. Now here's the kicker. The legend says that just as the bonds hit rock bottom, Rothschild's agents secretly swept in and bought up everything for pennies on the dollar. So when the official news of victory finally arrived, the market skyrocketed and the family fortune was said to have multiplied 20 times over. The myth wasn't just that they got rich, it was that they could literally bend markets and even nations to their will. It's an incredible story, right? It's got genius, ruthlessness, incredible foresight. It's like a Hollywood thriller. But we have to stop and ask the most important question. Did any of that actually happen? Okay, so let's put the legend aside for a second and look at the historical record. What do the actual documents, the financial records from June 1815, really tell us? Well, their conclusion is pretty much unanimous and crystal clear. There is zero credible evidence from that time to support this dramatic story of a market crash. The tale of Nathan Rothschild standing there and orchestrating a massive panic, it appears to be a total fabrication, something that first showed up in print decades later as a piece of anti-finance propaganda. And this really lays it all out. On one side, you've got the legend. Secret courier, early news, crashes the market, makes a huge fortune overnight. But then you look at the record. It turns out lots of couriers had the news. There's no proof Rothschild was first. And get this, surviving letters actually show Nathan was buying government bonds, betting on a British victory, not selling them to cause a panic. And while, yeah, the family did profit, they were already one of the wealthiest in Europe. Waterloo didn't create their empire. It was just another successful day at the office. So this brings us to what might be the most fascinating question of all. If the story is so clearly false, why is it stuck around for 2 centuries? Why do people keep telling it? And more importantly, believing it? Yeah, even though historians have thoroughly debunked it, the Waterloo legend just seems to have a life of its own. You see it pop up in books, in movies, all over the internet, presented as if it's a known fact. It has this incredible immunity to evidence, which tells you something really profound about the power of a good story. So why? Why does it survive? Well, because it gave a simple, powerful explanation for a world that was becoming incredibly complex. It tapped into this deep public fear of a new kind of power, international finance, a power that wasn't tied to a king or a country, that could move money invisibly across borders and seemed to play by its own secret rules. The myth gave a face to that faceless fear. And that's really the big takeaway here. The Rothschild Waterloo legend is the perfect example of how a really compelling story can become more real than reality itself. It's a story that tells us less about financial history and a whole lot more about human psychology, about our need for clear bad guys and good guys, and our willingness to choose a great story over a complicated truth. It really makes you wonder, what other powerful stories do we all accept as fact just because the belief is so much stronger than the evidence?
All right, let's get right into it. We're going to talk about a name that for most people means two things: just an incredible amount of wealth and an even bigger cloud of conspiracy. We're looking at the Rothschild legacy and trying to figure out how a family of bankers became a global myth.
You know, some names just feel different, don't they? They carry a certain weight. They bring up images, feelings, whole histories, really. And it's hard to think of a name in the last couple of centuries that carries more weight or more baggage than Rothschild.
So here's the big question we're tackling today. How on earth did one family go from being, really rich and powerful bankers to becoming this worldwide symbol for a hidden hand that's secretly pulling all the strings? To figure that out, we have to start with the whispers themselves.
For literally centuries, these accusations have been swirling around, painting this picture of some kind of power that's working just out of sight.
And then the whispers get even darker. The idea that huge global conflicts aren't really about politics or countries, but are just, business deals, things engineered just to make money. And then, the biggest claim of all, that entire governments, whole nations, are basically just puppets. So these are the legends. They're powerful, and they've stuck around for a long time. But where did they come from?
Well, to find the source of the myth, you got to look at the reality. And it all started way back in the 18th century with one guy, Mayer Amschel Rothschild. He built a bank, and then he sent his 5 sons out to the biggest financial centers in Europe. By the 19th century, this family network was so powerful and so unbelievably rich, you just couldn't ignore them.
And the scale of what they were doing, it's kind of mind-blowing. We're not talking about small business loans here. They were funding the actual building blocks of the modern world. The railways that connected entire continents, the governments that were running nations, the empires that were drawing the maps, even the industrial revolutions that were changing everything about how people lived.
And this, you have to understand, was a totally new kind of power. It wasn't like a king with a crown or a general with an army. It was the power of money, and it was essential. They didn't have to be on the throne, because the people who were on the thrones needed their cash to rule. So here's the crucial part. When the average person starts to see that a big pile of money can be way more powerful than a king or a government, things get weird. It creates this feeling of uncertainty, and that uncertainty turns into suspicion. People start wondering, wait a minute, who's really in charge here? And it's right there, in that perfect breeding ground of suspicion, that all those whispers we talked about earlier really start to take off. This is that moment where the historical fact, a super wealthy and influential family, starts to get twisted into something much, much darker.
And these stories, they just spread like wildfire, way faster than the truth ever could. Because think about it. The idea that one secret group is controlling all the banks, owning the news, manipulating countries, and starting wars, it's a simple answer for a world that feels really complicated and out of control.
But this wasn't just, harmless gossip. This stuff got weaponized. Right from the get-go, anti-Semitic writers used the family's Jewish heritage to stir up old, ugly prejudices. Political extremists from the far left to the far right all pointed to them as the secret enemy. And of course, most famously, Nazi propaganda made them a centerpiece of their whole hateful ideology. And you still see echoes of that in conspiracy theories floating around today.
And this, right here, is the key. The family itself, the actual human beings, they almost became beside the point. The name, Rothschild, became something else entirely. It became a symbol, a kind of shorthand for all our fears about hidden power, global money, and secret control.
Okay, so let's put it all together now. Let's draw that line really clearly between what actually happened and the massive legend that grew out of it. Let's look at how real-world influence got distorted into this giant symbolic myth. So look at the reality. They've funded governments. The legend twists that into they control nations. The reality, their money helped build railroads. The legend spins that into they start wars for profit. The reality is they've financed empires, and that gets warped into this idea that they're ruling from the shadows. You see, every part of the legend is like a dark, twisted reflection of a real historical fact.
Which really leaves us with one last big question to think about. The story of the Rothschilds is this amazing example of how money and power can spin up a story so huge, so powerful that it just completely swallows the real people involved. It makes you wonder what happens when a family's name doesn't really belong to them anymore, but belongs to a global myth.
You know, there are some names in history that just feel heavier than others. Names that carry centuries of rumor, of power, of controversy. So, Rothschild. Let's dive in and really deconstruct the story behind the name.
And this quote, it really nails the whole point of our conversation today. It's all about what happens when we can't see who's in charge. When power doesn't have a face, we tend to fill in that blank with our own worst fears. This is the key that unlocks why this one family's story ballooned into such a massive global myth.
Okay, so to get to the truth of it, we have to start with the historical record. Let's try to peel back all those layers of myth and legend and just look at what we can actually, factually confirm.
So, what does history actually tell us? Well, for one, they financed wars. Now, that sounds dramatic, but it was a pretty standard and very profitable business for almost every major bank of that era. They also benefited from colonial systems, working with powerful empires to build their own wealth. But here's the kicker. They didn't create this system. They just got incredibly good at navigating its often brutal rules. Which, of course, brings us to the big question, the one that history always seems to ask but never really answers. Looking at all this, were their actions moral?
And the answer is, well, it's complicated. There's no easy yes or no here. Whether you see their actions as moral or not really, truly depends on who you are, where you're standing, and when you're asking the question.
And this right here shows you the huge gap between the story and the reality. The myths, the conspiracies. They talk about secret world domination, about a small group of evil masterminds pulling all the strings of history. But when historians actually look for the hard evidence, the proof for these wild claims just isn't there.
So what we're left with isn't some comic book story of supervillains. It's the story of a family that learned, with incredible skill, how to master the rules of a game that was already being played. A system that was, and often is, brutal.
All right, so that raises the obvious question, right? If they weren't secretly pulling the strings, then how on earth did their name become the symbol for hidden power? Let's dig into how they became the face of a system that they didn't even create. To really get it, we have to be super clear on what they didn't do. First off, they did not invent greed. Come on, that's been with humanity from the very beginning.
And they didn't invent capitalism. They were amazing players in that system, maybe some of the best ever. But they didn't write the rule book. And no, they did not invent war. Conflict is as old as we are. They financed it, absolutely, but they weren't the ones starting the fights.
But, and this is so important, they became the face of it all. For regular people trying to make sense of these huge, invisible forces like global finance and politics, well, the name Rothschild became a simple, powerful, and easy-to-blame shorthand for the whole shebang.
Okay, let's fast forward to the present day. What's the deal with the Rothschild name now? Well, what you find is that the name is much more of a symbol than it is an actual empire.
The reality of the family today is a world away from the myth. That massive fortune has been split up and diluted across many, many generations. Their direct political influence is pretty limited. At this point, their power is almost entirely symbolic. It's a name that represents a bygone era of finance.
I mean, just put it into perspective. We live in a world of tech titans and new money billionaires, people whose individual fortunes and influence can eclipse what's left of the entire Rothschild family. The centers of financial power have totally shifted.
And yet, even with that reality check, the myth just keeps going. It's incredibly persistent. And you have to ask, why? Well, it's because some stories, especially the ones that tap into our deepest anxieties, are just too powerful to die.
So this brings us to our final and maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. Why?
Why does this one story still have such a grip on our imagination? It's because it's not really about history anymore. It's about us. It's a mirror that reflects our own fears back at us.
So at the end of the day, when we talk about the Rothschilds, we're not really talking about one family anymore. Their name has become a vessel, a container for a much larger conversation.
It's a story about that universal fear of hidden power, that nagging feeling that someone, somewhere, is pulling the strings. It's a cautionary tale about the very real danger of myths and how easily they can swallow the truth. It's an exploration of how money can literally reshape history. And maybe, most critically, it shows us how a symbol can become so powerful that it completely outlives the facts it was based on.
So, if we strip everything away one last time, what are we left with? They were not gods, moving humanity around like pieces on a chessboard.
And they were not demons orchestrating evil just for the sake of it. The reality is something much more human.
They were humans, exceptionally smart, incredibly ambitious humans, who figured out, better than almost anyone, how the world really works. They understood the true levers of power, money, and influence, and they simply used that knowledge.
And the thought that they weren't mythical monsters, but just people who mastered the very system we all live in. Maybe, just maybe, that's the most unsettling truth of all.